All right, let's talk about a topic that I think is actually fascinating, and hopefully you will concur with me. And the topic is your own interpreting or translation style. How and where does it come about? How does it come about? How do you develop it? What does it depend on? And so on. Because just think about it. Not every single translator or interpreter of the same author, poet, or speaker is obviously going to translate or interpret him the same way. And one of my own maxims, or axioms rather, is that the same thing has almost innumerable correct translations. Well, maybe not countless or innumerable, but many, 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 a myriad of proper and correct translations. So let's run with these ruminations and see where they take us. First, I'm going to share a principle that I learned in a business book. And the principle talked about how somebody becomes a master and opens up their own school of thought or school of doing. And it said that step number one is to be grounded in the basics and the ABCs of whatever is considered classic in that profession at the time, right? Step number two is to become a master or very, very well versed in that classic school. Step number three would be to develop your own style, your own bent, that doesn't necessarily deviate from that school, but your own style. And step number four would be to develop your own school of thought or your own philosophy of that particular subject. And if you think of any great artists or geniuses, then pretty much they did that. They at least rose up to number three, and some of them didn't really want to start their own school, but think of like Picasso. He was very well grounded, and I'm guessing what was the classicism of painting, right? Or think of any composer, writer you admire who sort of maybe deviated from the classic school of thought or school of art, and they did just that. They're usually very, very well versed and grounded in the classic tradition, and then they choose to go their own way. And that also answers the question of can you or can't you or should you or shouldn't you break rules? Well, my personal take, in case you want to know, Translation, who's listening to this clip, definitely wants to know. But my personal take on whether or not you can not deviate, but break rules is yes, if you're doing it wittingly and knowingly. If you're breaking rules and principles because you don't know that they are such, then no. That's bad. That's usually subpar professionalism or not professionalism at all. But if you know what the rules are and you believe that in this case it's better to do something different, then why the heck not? I do it all the time, so it must be right. Joke, sort of. Okay, so I'm going to use my little cheat sheet. Here I wrote down the points for me. So what does your own style depend on and how do you develop it? Well, obviously it depends on the school of whatever that you studied. In our case, it would be translation and interpreting, right? Recently, to my surprise, I found that the European and the Russian school differ from the American school of interpreting. I was talking to my colleague Andre about it, and he said, you know, Vladimir, you have more the American school, which is more similar to the UN school, and I have the Russian European school. And I said, what's the difference? And he said, well, we're taught to do more narrative translation, that sometimes actually it's okay to paraphrase, that sometimes people want us to paraphrase or summarize, and so on. And you guys are taught to, basically interpret not word for word, but concept for concept. And especially me, because I come from the court interpreting school. So these are already two different schools of interpreting, right? And I'm sure that each and every country teaches things slightly differently. Okay, we could also say that not just your professional background, but your family or educational background and the vocabulary and the mannerisms, not mannerisms, but manner of speech and the phrases and the colloquialisms that were used in your household or in your school or in your city, they obviously influence you. Like somebody actually caught on to me just recently. I guessed this girl's country, which was very impressive, and she guessed my city, which was even more impressive. I said, how did you know I was from St. Petersburg? And she was like, you have that St. Petersburgian vibe about you. She guessed. So that definitely affects your style more than you think, maybe. The authors you admire, the speakers you admire, whom you listen to and maybe replicate to some degree. There's nothing wrong with that. It doesn't mean you're being a copycat, but we all study and learn from the speakers and authors we admire, right? And there's nothing wrong with that whatsoever. Like, I'm sure in my writing, there is Pushkin, there is some Tolkien, many different authors, you know? Hopefully not Dostoevsky. No, nothing wrong with Dostoevsky, but I'm not a huge fan. Okay, your own personality, your own style of speech obviously is going to affect it. Vladimir is not going to translate things the same as Larry, the same as Rick, and so on and so forth. You know, we all bring our own personality into our translation to some degree. And we'll talk about that in a second, or maybe we should talk about that now. But people say, well, you have to match the speaker, you have to translate or interpret the speaker. True, but we already talked about this. The speaker can be translated or interpreted in many different ways. Do you really and realistically think that your own background and culture and education and personality are not going to affect it? Like, even take a no-brainer example. If somebody is from Argentina versus Mexico versus Spain versus Venezuela versus the south of the United States, well, that's not even Spanish. I'm just kidding. That's Spanglish. Aren't they going to interpret or translate things differently? Of course. But a person is their own microcosm, and they have their own, you know, style and their own components of style, the same that each Spanish has its own components. So even when we're translating the same speech, interpreting the same speech, or translating the same text, it's going to differ. All right, obviously your culture and the languages that you speak are going to affect things. Don't think that, for example, if you're going from English into Italian, it isn't going to matter if you also speak Arabic or French or Russian or whatever. Of course it's going to matter, because a language shapes our thought process to some degree. How could it not? Because it has its own idioms, its own phrases. Like, for example, do you not think that a Spanish speaker, if they know the song Amar y Querer, right, a famous Mexican song by Jose Jose, which doesn't even have a direct translation, to love or to love, or to love or to fall in love, right? There are two different versions of love. Like, so Spanish has two words for love. Do you not think that that's not going to affect a lot of double negatives or triple negatives, your rendition of whatever it is that you're rendering? Okay, and then other training, other schooling, other pursuits are also going to affect it. If somebody is an athlete or a sportsman, to be British, of course it's going to affect things. Like, I'm considering translating this book by an athlete who's also a businessman, and he brings his sports training into his training of leaders professionally. Like, his whole book is based on how sports could be used as an analogy for training leaders. So obviously, and the fact that I'm a runner or a swimmer, both, and a chess player, is going to affect things. Like, same with chess players, for example. All the greats know the same openings, they know the same tactics, they know the principles of the endgame. Does that mean that they play the same? Of course not. You know, and it depends on their teachers, on their coaches, and on their personality. Like, I have seen chess players who are super defensive, and they're good chess players, and chess players who are super offensive, not in the way that you thought, not offensive as an insulting, but who are prone to attack, and chess players who are in the middle. Okay, so those are the factors I wanted to talk about. Now let's talk about how style affects things, how you can shift style, how you can develop your style. Well, to develop, you basically, I think, would do the things that I just mentioned. So for example, if you want to hone your own style, I know I have my own style, but if you don't think that you have it, you need, I think, a lot of quantity. Like, one very prolific and successful writer said that until a writer writes this many thousand words, and I don't remember what the number was, but it was like not egregiously, but surprisingly high, that writer would never know their own style. And that's true. So you have to walk through not necessarily the valley of the shadow of death or the valley of death, but you have to walk through many an assignment to know what your style even is, right? And it keeps changing. I'm sure my style today is not the same as my style 5 years ago, is not the same as my style 20 years ago, and so on. So with each and every little thing you learn, your style can shift, right? It's a conglomeration or concatenation or a medley of techniques as well. For example, I remember interpreting, this was around the Sochi Olympics, so it must have been like 10 years ago or so, 12 years ago, whatever. And this guy who was the delegation leader, I believe, or at least he was an interpreter of the delegation and also a professor of translation and interpreting, he listened to me. He said, I really like your rhythm, but he did have a tip for me. And the tip was that if there's some factual information or like some little tidbit at the end, why don't you just spit it out at the beginning so you don't have to remember? And I was like, that's not bad. And I've learned many other tips from other professionals. And each of these things you adopt as your own technique, and that shapes your style to a degree. And same with working in a different context or in a different ambience or with a different speaker. So that's how you develop. You do a little bit of this, a little bit of this, a little bit of this. And I would say that my style is pretty versatile. That even rhymes. Like this lady asked me 2 days ago, what's your Spanish like? And I said, I don't know. It's probably a medley because I've learned from professors from this country and friends from this country. And when she heard me, she said, yeah, you're right. It's a mixture, but it sounds pretty neutral. Anyway, my style is probably a mixture because I came from the school of court interpreting, but I've also done a lot of like business and motivational interpreting. I've translated texts about religion and fiction and poetry and so on. So I run the whole gamut, literally run the whole gamut from 400 to marathon. Ha ha ha. And actually that's not a gamut, that's a spectrum of distances, but whatever. So that's how you develop. I think you should try various fields of interpreting or translation. You can learn from each one. You can learn from medical, you can learn from technical, you can learn from court, you can learn from fiction, you can learn from poetry. I'm talking now about translating, but same with interpreting, And each one gives you a particular paradigm of thinking. And then you can also take classes from different tutors and teachers. For example, I just had to work this in there. I absolutely had to work this in there. I'm going to betray this series I'm currently watching called Outlander, but I'm not going to betray it too badly because I'm going to give an example from Highlander. So both are Landers and both are from Scotland or about Scotland to a degree. And Highlander is this swordsman, an immortal, and he has to learn the craft and the art of sword fighting to protect himself because other mortals are busy wanting to chop off his head. And he only chops off the heads of really bad ones like Arnold Schwarzenegger, remember? In True Lies, his wife asks him, so have you ever killed anybody? And he's like, yeah, but they were all bad. Anyway, so he does a very smart thing. I think that was a brilliant, ingenious strategy on his part. He goes and learns sword fighting from different schools, from the samurai, from the Italian and French masters. He learns from all these different schools and he creates his own style. And by the way, somebody may not wish to create their own school of whatever. Like for example, Magnus Carlsen, arguably the greatest chess player in the world, at least today. He is the highest rated. He does not have his own school of teaching or school of chess, but he has his own style. So stepping from step 3, remember in the algorithm that I gave you at the beginning, step 3 was developing your own style and step 4 was developing your own school, is sort of optional if it happens if a person wants to. So where am I going with this? So yeah, Duncan basically developed his own style, Duncan MacLeod. And that's what I recommend that you do is, as we already discussed, interpret in as many different fields as you can, or translate, learn from different teachers, develop very versatile vocabulary. Like for example, one of my colleagues, a presidential interpreter, he heard me and he said, it's very cool, Vladimir, that you are equally well versed in high register English and American slang. And that's actually kind of cute when you can intersperse one with the other, intersperse slang into high-level speech. It actually makes it more alive when it's appropriate, Okay, so we're pretty much rounding up, but this is one thing I want to say. A style should never be rigid. It should be flexible. Just because you have a certain style does not mean that you shouldn't adopt it. Give you an example of Duncan MacLeod. He's fighting this villain, or rather villainess, and he pulls a trick on her and he defeats her, and she's like, how did you know to do that? And he says, oh, that's a trick the Italians taught me for overly aggressive opponents. So he sees her style and he adopts his style to her. Or for example, I was watching this chess lesson and the grandmaster says, well, normally the best move here would be this or this, but I actually made this move in the game because of specific preparation against this opponent. So he knew what the opponent's weaknesses were and he adopted his style accordingly just in that particular game. So for example, my style, usually I like longer segments because they're easier to manipulate, they're easier to juggle, and so on. But if I'm interpreting a topic that I don't know very well and I'm not catching on as facile a fashion to the speaker, then I will opt for shorter segments because I don't want to lose anything, Or if the speaker just really prefers shorter segments, although usually I sort of adjust them to my style, but if they really insist on doing shorter segments, fine, Or I can, tone down my register, or I can tone up, quote unquote, my register, and so on. You obviously do, when you're interpreting or translating, you clearly do want to match the speaker's or the writer's style. You do. No question about it, especially if that's what they want. Sometimes they'll say, I like your style, please make your own stylistic decisions. But every author, usually, and every speaker has their own style. So we do want to match it. But there is no getting away from having your own style as well. It would equally be a mistake to bring in too much of your own style into the speaker's or author's style. To give you an example, in the book, I think it's called The Art of Translation by Russian poet and scholar Chukovsky, he gives an example of how the Russian poet Balmont was translating, I think it was either Stevenson or Robert Burns, Scottish poet, and Balmont had his own convictions about poetry that he considered lewd or improper or whatever, because he was a very romantically religious person. So he would bring in too much Balmont into the translation, and he would actually change the meaning, and he would change the style, and he would make it more romantic, lofty, and proper. And that is, of course, unacceptable. So one should be paying homage and paying tribute, and doing the best for the author to the best of one's ability. I'm talking about something slightly different. You cannot help but bring in your own style inadvertently, because it is part of your speech, it is part of your writing, it is part of the way that you speak and or write. That's what I'm talking about. But of course, naturally, unequivocally, do the best that you possibly can to match your author's or speaker's style and manner, of course. So your style should never be rigid, and in fact, any master is never completely rigid in style. The Impressionists or the Cubists could probably paint, well, I don't know about the Cubists, but for sure the Impressionists could probably paint in classic style just fine, So that just about finishes it up. What's my call to action besides all the proper things to say, like put a like, because if not, I will haunt you in the night. No, please subscribe and like and all the jazz. But develop your own style, like become an interpreter, and when people hear you or read your translation, they know, it's this guy, Like, for example, sometimes when people see my articles, they're like, oh, that's Vladimir. And of course, I'm not going to bring my style 100% into my translation or interpreting, but to some percent, to some degree, it's inevitable not to. Okay, so that's my call to action. Develop your style, and that takes quality teachers, quality training, and also it takes quantity, many different jobs, after which okay, I have my own style. So yeah, comment, rate me, tell me how you applied this clip, and let's make this world better, and Translation proud of us by always watching over the standards, the high and lofty standards of translation. And I believe that developing your own style definitely aids in this pursuit, because you'll have to become a master to develop your own style. All right, out for now.